So, Dave, what was your relationship with film as a teenager?
Oh, what can I say? I was already pretty obsessed film buff by then. I started very young, much as Joe did, I think. Yeah.
As you were saying before, we both share a passion for genre film, and popular filmmaking that hides a subversive streak. And can we bring expand on the idea that these films that are they're low budget and they are supposed to be just pure entertainment, and they are to be they hide and it's a sort of American cinema that is like that, hide something much more interesting and a commentary on the present and so forth. And this is kind of a reflection on that.
Yeah, well, genre film is a surprisingly liberating format when you are dealing with stock situations, stock characters. You have a lot of freedom how to move them around. It looks very safe and commercial, but you can get away with an awful lot just because people are not expecting. This is the kind of movie that the front office would never bother to watch, even. I can't imagine Harry Cohn saw any of William Castle's films when he was running Columbia. Just no reason to. He was worried about the Rita Hayworth pictures, the things that were really classy and expensive and would get the critics' attention. And there's a paradoxical amount of freedom that comes with a very low budget in Hollywood.
And how would you say that Joe's generation and Carpenter and Landis and these people have embraced that idea and expanded on the power of this kind of films to be actually political in a quite overt way?
I think a lot of the popular American directors of the 70s had been monster kids in the 50s and 60s. It's what they call themselves. They read that magazine, Famous Monsters of Filmland, that you see in this film. That's how they got into movies, was trying to penetrate the special effects in Universal horror films, just appreciating the design of those characters. John Landis becomes obsessed with gorilla suits because he loved gorilla movies. Joe's probably the most scholarly and reflective of that bunch. He actually started writing movie reviews for that magazine when he was like 12 or something, really young. Had a column called Dante's Inferno, in which he had a lot of fun, criticizing and engaging with things like the deadly mantis and even worse.
And when did you discover Joe's work?
I was imagining, one of the first critics to take him seriously. I remember seeing Hollywood Boulevard, was his first film, at a grindhouse in Chicago, and what would that have been, 72, maybe? And then I really liked Piranha, his next movie, and at that point I was writing for a weekly newspaper in Chicago called The Reader, and I gave that a big piece. At some point I did an article for Film Comment on 5 directors to watch from Roger Corman's New World Pictures, and it was Joe and Jonathan Demme, Jonathan Kaplan, George Armitage, and Paul Bartel, and they were all kind of unknown at that point, but yeah, there was a lot to be found in those days because nobody else was really looking at this level of film.
And were they successful? I was still in Italy at the time. How successful they were?
Well, not successful in the sense of a Jaws success. I mean, these were low-budget movies that would play at drive-ins, at the big grindhouses in big cities. They were cheap to rent. Some of them just went for a flat fee instead of a percentage of the budget, percentage of the gross, rather. So they did not play in prestige houses. They were very cheap to make. They didn't pull in a whole lot of money, but they pulled in certainly enough money to justify their existence and get started on the next one. So it's not a blockbuster mentality at all. That's something that comes later with Spielberg.
Speaking of Spielberg, Joe and Spielberg started together and they collaborated. And Joe always feels like the naughtier the most the unruliest child of the two.
Well, Gremlins, which is a film I like a lot, but you can see a lot of Spielberg in there, and you feel Joe kind of fighting against the sentimentality and the manipulation, the very heavy emotional, the cheap use of music to jerk you around somewhat. And then Gremlins 2, the sequel, is Joe unfiltered. It's a Warner Brothers cartoon. It's just total anarchy. Extremely unsentimental. I mean, really kind of mean and nasty and fun, and the sensibility of Mad Magazine from the 50s and 60s, which was also something that influenced Joe in that generation quite a bit.
The absurdist quality of the humor. Do you have any questions? No?
Okay.
Okay. Yes.
But what kind of movies, can you hear me?
Yeah.
What kind of movies movie houses did they play in? I lived in a small Brooklyn neighborhood. Where were they?
They were around 42nd Street, some of the rougher theaters, I grew up in the suburbs of Chicago, and we had these at drive-ins all over the place. It was really the main market for these films were the drive-ins, which are mainly patronized by teenagers. Not too many drive-ins in Brooklyn, no, yeah.
Hold on, Hillary, hold on. We can't hear you. Wait for the mic. It's coming.
I remember the Tingler, which it was Hastings-on-the-Hudson, which is a small suburban town outside of New York. And that was one of the first scary movies by this guy that I'd ever seen. So they were around, and not just
Do you
the
remember
drive-ins.
the Percepto? Did they have the theater rigged?
That I don't remember.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I was amused by the early promotions that you talked about. I remember as a boy in Ohio before the war, Frankenstein came to town, and there was a big ad in the local paper that said the Ohio Theater will give a new refrigerator to any woman who can sit alone in the dark and watch Frankenstein all the way through.
How many did they give away?
I told Dave this earlier, but I saw the Tingler on Cleveland local TV, and there was a Friday night horror show, and it was hosted by this guy, and his persona was Goulardi. He was an actor by the name of Ernie Anderson, who is the father of Paul Thomas Anderson, who's the filmmaker now. So that's why PTA's production company is called Goulardi's. But I remember this among many, many films on this Friday night show. Right here?
Yeah. You mentioned that the head of Columbia would probably not see these films. My question is, did this genre of film get shown abroad? In other markets than the United States?
Oh, definitely, yeah. These would have played all over the place. There are dubbed versions. I've seen a couple of Universal films dubbed in French, which are very funny. But yeah, these were definitely exported.
The fly that was the fly with the Vincent Price with the poster. I remember the dub version in Italy. When Vincent Price standing instead of say "help me," he was like "aiuto." Nick.
When it was funny, I was like, "Is that Naomi Watts?" And the shopping girl
definitely
thing.
Naomi Watts. Yeah.
And I was trying. How old was she at the time? Is that her first
I
first
think
credit? Or
I believe it is. Yeah.
Yeah.
She's in one shot, I think.
I was curious, because we've looked at a lot of cinemas in research, and there's the Tropic Cinema is in Key West. So where was this shot? There's not a Key West strand. Where was it shot?
I'm mostly on the back lot at Universal. I've been to Key West, and I don't remember anything that looks like that.
Right.
They may have looked like they did some stuff along the coast for the flyover with the airplanes. Probably a few days down there to get some.
Yeah.
Some of the scenes where the kids are walking down the street, and you see those white houses, which seem very distinctively Key West to me. So I imagine some of the exteriors were there, but most of it's backlotted Universal. Yeah.
There is a Universal studio in Florida as well, so I'm sure they use some of that.
Oh yeah,
of that,
'cause that
that
would have opened around the
facility,
same
yeah.
time. Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah.
No doubt, a good deal of it was there. Mhm.
As we were talking before about the sort of this not consider serious films, and I'd like for you to tell them what you were telling me when we were walking outside about Wells, and that is in William Castle's autobiography, because it's an interesting story as a follow-up to your comments on Lady of Shanghai at the beginning.
Trying to think now.
Yeah, well, you remember when I said I didn't know the story, the Wells and Castle story, that I didn't know about Lady of Shanghai, and just
Yeah, I mean, kind of the sequel to that is that the Castle stopped taking his work seriously, and toward the end of his career, he obtained the rights to Rosemary's Baby, and he, as he says in his autobiography, he knew he was not the man to make this movie, and they went and got Polanski, who of course made a great film of it. But just that self-consciousness of knowing that he really wasn't the right casting for this and stepping aside. And the autobiography is very appealing. He's like a very sympathetic, grounded, funny person. You know, someone you would, I wish I had met him. I never did. It's unusual to find that kind of modesty in this film industry, but he certainly had it, you know, in despite of his, you know, he clearly relished the crowd. He liked being a pitch man. He liked, a lot of what he was doing was modeled on what Alfred Hitchcock had done, including copying the silhouette. He had a little trademark of himself sitting in a director's chair, very Hitchcockian, and he called himself the master of shock, as opposed to Hitchcock being the master of suspense. And it's interesting because then Hitchcock turned it all around on Castle by making a William Castle horror film in 1960 called Psycho, which really took the things that Castle was doing, low budget, black and white, no stars, and it made the shock film of all time. So Hitch kind of got his own back there in a big way. Smell-o-vision.
yeah, or Odorama, right?
Well, that was the John Waters.
John Waters polyester
parody
with Divine,
version.
yeah.
But yeah, Smell-o-vision was one of those gimmicks from the 50s. It was developed by Michael Todd, who had introduced Todd AO, which was a spectacular widescreen process, and he'd been involved in the development of Cinerama, which were the 3 separate film strips being projected at once. And this was supposed to be the next dimension, and they came up with this crazy thing they called the scent organ, which was this electrical device that would release vials full of scent at the right moments in the movie that then waft through the theater. We heard of the museum just a few weeks ago from the daughter of the man who invented the scent organ, and she's in Australia, and she says she has rebuilt it, and looking to show it in New York City, so we may have that at some point in the future. The movie is called Scent of Mystery, and it's really bad, but you know.
Well, I had a screening, an Odorama screening that with the polyester. It was a much cheaper invention. You were giving cards, and you had to just wipe them. You know, there would be a sign on the thing, and Divine was farting, and then you scratch, and it's like you're hit by the fart smell.
Somebody hold up a tennis shoe.
So and it was a film club in Italy, and it was sort of an underground. Actually, it was literally underground. You had to go downstairs to view it. At the end of that screening, that whole room, because it's a John Waters, so it was vomit, fart, rotten eggs. So the combined smells in that room was just memorable, like really memorable, really, really memorable. Dave,
But you don't get that on Netflix, right?
no, you don't get No, you don't. No, you don't. Dave, how would you compare the relationship that Joe and the filmmakers of his generation have with film and the way they use it to more contemporary filmmaker like J.J. Abrams or so? These are all people that sort of grew, or even Tarantino, that grew up on film. But it seems that the relationship that they have, which is also some of what you had, is different.
I think it's a question of not taking it all that seriously. You know, they absorbed these films, they enjoyed them, they wanted to make something else. Or I get the feeling with people like J.J. Abrams or the Knives Out guy, what's his name, Ryan Johnson. It becomes very heavy and ponderous, and it's overproduced, and it's just too much, and the fun kind of goes away, to me at least, at a certain point. It just, trying to remake something, but remaking it in such a bloated, portentous way that it doesn't seem to have the charm and lightness and yeah, and the real subversiveness that some of these films could have.
Is there one more? No, then we're going to thank Dave for being here.
Thank you for having me.
And we will be opening soon. So next time, and I hope you appreciated the matching seat from the theater to this one's.